Good afternoon. It is a privilege to speak here today about a paper that is in many ways a paper about limits, the limit of knowledge, the limits of legal technique, the limits of epistemic confidence, and also the limits of authority in antitrust. Before turning to the argument of the paper, I would like to begin with a brief tribute to the late Professor Heike Schweitzer. Professor Schweitzer was one of the rare legal scholars who combined conceptual clarity, doctrinal seriousness, and institutional realism. She understood something that many debates in competition law obscure, that antitrust is not merely a legal ritual, nor an abstract economic discipline, not just an instrument of policy ambition. It is a practical institution that must act under uncertainty with real procedural constraints and against fact-changing markets. Her work, especially on abuses of dominance in digital markets, was marked by two realities. The first was intellectual ambition. She was willing to rethink legal categories, evidentiary burdens, and enforcement frameworks when markets changed. The second one was discipline. She did not confuse ambition with improvisation. She wanted a stronger, more effective competition law, but one still anchored in legal reasoning and evidence. That combination matters enormously for the subject of the paper I want to discuss today, because this paper is at heart about how antitrust should respond when certainty is unavailable. And Professor Schweitzer's scholarship was itself a sustained engagement with that question. She recognized that under-enforcement could be as serious a danger as over-enforcement, that evidentiary burdens could paralyze the law, and that legal systems had to adapt if they wished to remain effective in concentrated digital markets. So this presentation begins in a spirit not only of respect, but also of conversation with her work. The paper I am presenting today shares with Professor Schweitzer's many contributions a deep concern for institutional capacity and for the real-world design of antitrust rules. But it also asks whether beneath disagreements over tools and burdens and presumptions, there lies a deeper disagreement still, a disagreement about what antitrust is ultimately for. That is the question I want to explore today. Let me state the central thesis plainly. The deepest disagreements in contemporary antitrust are not primarily disagreements about economics, evidence, legal rules, or enforcement attitude. They are disagreements about teleology, about the ends of antitrust, about what the law is for, and about how it should behave under uncertainty. The paper begins from a sober premise. Antitrust authorities and courts do not operate in a world of stable knowledge and confident inference. They operate in a world of radical uncertainty, incomplete evidence, evolving business models, contested economic theory, and limited institutional capacity. This means that the dream of a case-by-case optimization is often illusory. The real question then is not what rule would produce the ideal result in theory. The real question is what sort of legal rules perform robustly when decision makers are fallible, information is incomplete, and disagreement is persistent. That is why the paper treats antitrust as a second-best legal order. And once we adopt that perspective, a second insight follows immediately. Second-best design cannot be objective-free. We cannot know what sort of error we are willing to tolerate unless we know what goal the law is trying to serve. So the paper reconstructs three major teleological frameworks: consumer welfare, Republican non-domination, and common good constitutionalism, so welfare, freedom, and virtue. Each accepts uncertainty. Each rejects first-best fantasy, but each responds to uncertainty differently, because each answers differently the question, what is antitrust for? That is why antitrust debates persist even when empirical premises overlap. The dispute is not merely technical, it is moral, it is institutional, and constitutional. So let's go to this epistemic predicament. The paper's starting point is that antitrust should be first understood as a system of epistemically robust legal rules. In the textbook world, one might imagine that the law can examine every practice, reconstruct the counterfactual, balance all the effects, weight the efficiencies, predict future innovation, and then reach the optimal answer. But in the real world, decision makers face deep structural limits. Antitrust cases depend on unobservable counterfactuals, strategic interaction, dynamic effects, and rival narratives that may be observationally equivalent. Litigation is adversarial. Experts disagree. Feedback is weak and learning is slow. In such a world, the best legal rule is often not the rule that is theoretically most accurate. It is the rule that is most robust, the one that can be applied consistently, understood by firms, previsible, and administered by institutions without excessive variance or overconfidence. This is why we favor tools such as presumptions, evidentiary screens, safe harbors, structured burdens of proof, and remedial restraint. These are not signs of dogmatism, but manifestations of epistemic humility. Now, humility here does not mean inaction. We do not say because we are uncertain we should do nothing. We say something subtler, because uncertainty is structural. Legal design should avoid pretending that open-ended balancing can reliably deliver justice in every case. So far, this may sound like a familiar institutionalist or error cost argument, but then we move on to claim that even robust second-best rules can produce ex post injustice. They can wrongly condemn, they can wrongly acquit, they can impose unfair burdens in concrete cases. And when such errors become visible, salient, or morally vivid, they may undermine the legitimacy of the system itself. The implication is legitimacy is itself a dimension of robustness. A system that performs well on average may still fail if it generates enough visible injustice to provoke alienation, backlash, or mistrust. So second-best rules must be judged not only by ex-ante performance, but also by whether they can survive politically and morally in a plural society. Antitrust should thus be not only a system of epistemically robust legal rules, but also a robust system of legitimate rules. That is the bridge from epistemic design to teleology. All right. Yeah. So why teleology matters? Let us consider the deceptively simple question. How much inaccuracy are we willing to tolerate before the legitimacy of the system in question? The legitimacy of the system is in question. Inaccuracy, and then with respect to what goal? That question changes everything. If the goal is consumer welfare, then errors will be evaluated as welfare losses. If the goal is non-domination, then errors will be evaluated also in terms of arbitrary power and freedom. If the goal is common good, constitutionalism, common good, then errors may matter chiefly insofar as they disrupt peace, justice, flourishing, or moral order. This is why antitrust scholars and enforcers often argue past one another. They inhabit different teleological worlds. They may use the same vocabulary, error, effects, efficiencies, intervention, but then we mean very different things. So the controversy is not merely between more enforcement and less enforcement, or between economics and law, or between old and new antitrust. It is more fundamentally a controversy over moral thickness, normative closure, ex post injustice, and institutional design. Let me now turn to discuss the three theological frameworks in some detail. So, consumer welfare is thin, open, and systemic. This first framework is liberal welfarism or consumer welfare. On this view, antitrust should select rules that maximize expected consumer welfare subject to administrability and cognitive constraints. False positives and false negatives are both welfare costs. What matters is minimizing the expected aggregate cost across the system. This approach is morally thin. It does not ask whether outcomes are fair in a moral sense. It does not ask whether firms deserve condemnation, whether power is dignified, or whether the market reflects a substantive moral ideal. It asks an instrumental question. What institutional arrangement and which legal rules are most likely to improve consumer outcomes over time? Its virtues are evident. It is clarity, reusability, restraint, and resistance to moral grandiosity. Because the objective is thin, institutions are not asked to settle deep moral disputes. Disagreement is expected, revision is normal, and error is then survivable. But we can also diagnose the cost of this thinness. Consumer welfare can tolerate ex post injustice more easily than many citizens can. Wrongful condemnation, wrongful acquittal, or ruinous outcomes in individual cases are often treated as regrettable but second order. The framework is ex ante, systemic, and aggregate. This is where the legitimacy problem arises. A system may perform acceptably in expectation and still lose political support because it appears to be indifferent to visible injustice or durable dependency. That is the reason why thin welfarism may become fragile in environments where concentrated power is salient and case-specific unfairness is vivid. In short, welfarism might need an additional constraint to secure its legitimacy, some bound on unacceptable ex post outcomes. Now, Republican non-domination. This is the second framework associated above all with Philippe Petit. Here, the goal is not simply welfare, but freedom, understood as freedom from arbitrary power. This changes the antitrust lens considerably. On a Republican account, durable market power matters not only because it may rise prices or reduce output, but because it may render rivals, workers, suppliers, or users dependent on private discretion. A dominant platform, a monopolist employer, or a gatekeeper can dominate even before the textbook welfare harms fully materialize. At the same time, Republicans also worry about public domination. Wrongful enforcement can itself be arbitrary. So both false negatives and false positives are normatively serious. The danger is not only domination by firms, but also domination by the state. And this gives republicanism a distinctive posture. It is morally thicker than consumer welfare because it introduces an intrinsic moral constraint, which is non-domination. But it still resists normative closure because contestability is part of the ideal itself. Laws should not settle disagreement through authoritative moral finality. It should structure disagreement through checks, voice, review, reversibility, and non-arbitrary procedures. That is why republicanism is associated with tools such as rebuttable presumptions, meaningful escape valves, asymmetric thresholds, remedial restraint, and reversible interventions. This is an important point. Republicanism is not a call for free form balancing, quite the opposite. It wants institutions disciplined. It just wants them disciplined in a way that treats ex post domination as morally central. Now, the third framework is common good constitutionalism, associated chiefly with Adrian Vermeulen. This is the outlier from a philosophical perspective because it takes back to pre-modern days, but it is enjoying growing influence right and left on the ideological and political spectrum. Like the other approaches, it accepts epistemic limits. It is deeply skeptical of proportionality and balancing in real-world conditions. It agrees that decision makers lack the competence required for first-best adjudication. That's second order then. But it draws a radically different institutional conclusion. Where welfarists and Republicans respond to uncertainty by preserving openness, common good constitutionalism responds by reasserting authority, guided by substantial moral ends. The goal is not welfare, it is not non-domination, it is the common good, peace, abundance, flourishing, moral order, and protecting, preserving, and fostering the common good is adjudicated to a virtuous authority, so me in this case, whose decisions are final and necessarily virtuous. This makes the framework both highly morally thick and highly normatively closed. It claims that there is a correct orientation for law, rooted in moral tradition, and that law should settle disagreements through authoritative direction rather than leave it open-ended. That has serious consequences for antitrust, because if law is an instrument of substantive moral governance, then strong presumptions, directive remedies, hierarchical authority, and broad mandates can all be justified so long as they are aligned with the common good. Ex post injustice matters, but only when it threatens peace, growth, or the establishment order. It is not as a moral constraint in its own right. Of course, such a strong normative closure magnifies the cost of error. If the authority is wrong, its mistake is harder to contest, harder to reverse, and more likely to be embedded in rigid interventions. Closed systems are less able to learn. Common good constitutionalism is too confident about the moral authority of institutions in domains where uncertainty is permanent and contestation is unavoidable. The three theological schools can be compared along four axes: epistemic humility, moral thickness, normative closure, and sensitivity to ex post injustice. The important insight here is that all three schools score relatively high on epistemic humility. The deep divide is elsewhere. Consumer welfare is morally thin and normatively open, with relatively low sensitivity to ex post injustice. Republican non-domination is morally thicker, more attentive to injustice, but still normatively open. And then common good constitutionalism is thick and closed, with a more instrumental concern for injustice. Well, this debate is not new. I will stay here because I need to reflect a little bit before going to the proposal in the paper. The debate is not new. In the paper, we make a survey of the law and economics, philosophy, jurisprudence, and competition law scholarship. We conclude that anti-closure has been the model position across these traditions. Hayek, Easterbrook, and Posner resist moralized authority for epistemic and institutional reasons. Kant, Rawls, Sen and Parfit all thicken the evaluative space, but none endorse authoritative settlement in the Vermeulen sense. Hart, Fuller, Dworkin, Hamburger, and Sunstein, each in different ways, treat law as a way of governing disagreement, not ending disagreement. And among competition scholars, whether in Europe or in the United States, one sees the same pattern. Disagreement over intervention level, yes. Disagreement over legal form, yes. But broad reluctance to entrust antitrust authorities with moral finality or antitrust regime in itself. This supports the view that while antitrust should not be and cannot be value-free, it should be open to normative disagreement. Now, our preference is to depart from all existing approaches to antitrust to come up with a new, hybrid one. We regard Chicago, post-Chicago, and neo-Chicago as different manifestations of thin welfarism, insensitive to ex-post injustice, and therefore incapable of addressing the legitimacy concerns that I have discussed before. Neo-Brandesianism aligns most naturally with the Republican non-domination framework. However, it is internally divided, and the dominant strand is directive. It relies on moral authority to impose substantive ends under uncertainty. Some of its proposals substitute moral urgency for institutional discipline, thereby weakening the very contestability that non-domination requires. Republican welfarism is different. Welfare remains the ultimate evaluative standard for the selection of rules, for rule selection. Republican welfarism keeps welfare as the principal ex-ante objective, but it adds a Republican side constraint. This constraint prohibits certain forms of ex-post outcome where enforcement would produce domination, arbitrariness, non-contestable power, or irreversible harm disproportionate to evidentiary confidence. That is the key move. Republicanism here is not a rival goal that supplants welfare. It is a limit on how welfare may be pursued under uncertainty. So, Republican welfarism says, in effect, yes, choose robust rules, yes, optimize ex ante, yes, use presumptions and screens, but do not allow the pursuit of welfare to become a license for arbitrary or catastrophic injustice. This yields a distinctive legal architecture. Strong presumptions remain central, rebuttal remains limited, escape valves exist but are narrow, the injustice constraints is rule-like, not ad hoc, and remedies are especially important because they should be reversible, proportionate, and bounded. Unlike neo-Brandesianism, Republican welfarism is not a free-floating fairness mandate. Unlike common good, Republican welfarism rejects moral closure. It is explicitly fallibilist. And it is not pure welfarism either, because it refuses to treat all ex-post injustice as merely a second-order administrability cost. In one sentence, the model is robustness without closure. And this is a good moment to return to Professor Schweitzer, because she also plays a role in this story. If we compare Professor Schweitzer's position with Republican welfarism, the similarities are immediately striking. Both begin from institutional reality, not fantasy. Both reject the notion that antitrust can rely on exhaustive proportionality or perfect effect analysis in every case. Both understand that legal systems need structure, presumptions, and workable categories, and both are motivated in part by concern that under-enforcement may entrench private power, especially in complex and digital markets. So on epistemic humility, they are close, but the differences matter. Professor Schweitzer is more willing to believe that uncertainty can be managed through improved legal tools, stronger enforcement frameworks, a more proactive institutional posture. She is therefore more comfortable with earlier intervention and with recalibrating proof structures to restore enforceability. Republican welfarism is somewhat more cautious at precisely that point. It shares her concern about durable private power, but it insists more strongly that the cure must not create domination through the state. It places greater emphasis on contestability, reversibility, and bounded authority, and it is more sensitive to the possibility that enforcement itself may become arbitrary, especially when remedies are difficult to undo or when discretion expands faster than legal discipline. So if I were to summarize the contrast in a single sentence, I would say this. Professor Schweitzer represents an interventionist, institutionally serious welfarism aimed at overcoming under-enforcement, while Republican welfarism represents a legitimacy-conscious anti-domination refinement of welfarism aimed at preventing both private and public arbitrariness. And that, I think, is a fitting way to end with a well-known question, the question that terrifies all legal theorists. So what? The antitrust debate has long been framed as a problem of calibration, how to design rules and institutions that deliver the right level of intervention under conditions of uncertainty. On one point, there is wide agreement. Nearly everyone now accepts some form of epistemic humility. Authorities and courts act with incomplete evidence, unstable counterfactuals, contested economic theories, and limited institutional capacity. The old fantasy of perfectly tailored case-by-case optimization has lost much of its force. But once that common premise is accepted, disagreement over which rules result in the right level of intervention reigns free. Some advocate for more interventionist rules, for example, per se legality rules, because they fear false negatives. Others defend the use of safe harbors because they are mostly concerned about false positives. Yet all of them restrict attention to the way in which different rules impact enforcement on average across many cases. Economists do so because they are welfarists, jurists because of legal certainty, and politicians because of the median voter. But the deeper problem is that the rules advocated by one side and the other often ignore the consequences of individual error that I have termed as ex post injustice. A legal system may be fully aware that some mistakes are unavoidable and still fail to ask the right question. What happens when those mistakes materialize in ways that are arbitrary, salient, or irreversible? When an intervention imposes harm that cannot adequately be corrected? When a business or practice is condemned on weak grounds and the damage cannot be undone? Or when invisible injustice undermines confidence in the neutrality of enforcement, the issue is no longer merely technical. It becomes a problem of legitimacy. Antitrust does not lose legitimacy simply because it errs. It loses legitimacy when it appears indifferent to the human and institutional cost of its own errors. Not yet. That is why the dispute among scholars of antitrust thought cannot be reduced to a disagreement about the relative frequency of false convictions or false acquittals. The real divide concerns what each framework is prepared to do about ex post injustice. Some orthodox welfarists seem content to treat such injustice as secondary or as acceptable byproducts of a system aimed at maximizing welfare in expectation, but that will not do. A regime that refuses to confront the legitimacy costs of its own mistakes risks hollowing out the very authority of which it depends. At the other extreme, common good constitutionalism offer a more ambitious but ultimately more dangerous response. They propose, in effect, to overcome disagreement by displacing fallible, welfare-based rules with a more morally confident authority, the virtuous, purposive, and empowered authority to impose substantive order from above. But authoritarian confidence is no solution to the legitimacy problem. It merely relocates discretion into institutions that are less constrained, less accountable, and potentially more prone to arbitrary ex post injustice. Our proposal is different. We should retain welfare-based rules as the best available framework for organizing antitrust under uncertainty, but supplement them with ex post constraints designed to limit injustice when the system gets things wrong. That is the core of Republican welfarism. It does not abandon welfare analysis, nor does it romanticize authority. Instead, it accepts fallibility. I, as an authority, know what this is, and asks how welfare-oriented institutions can be designed so that their mistakes do not become acts of domination. The aim is not eliminate error, that is impossible, but to ensure that enforcement remains bounded, revisable, and attentive to the legitimacy costs of coercion. In that sense, Republican welfarism is a defense both of antitrust and against its excesses. The larger point is simple. Legitimacy cannot be restored by assertion, moral fervor, or institutional self-confidence. It cannot be claimed in advance by invoking virtue or public purpose. It has to be earned through outcomes and preserved through constraints. A system that promises justice by concentrated power may instead generate even greater injustice after the fact. A system that, on the contrary, acknowledges its own fallibility and disciplines itself, then that is what we believe should be the answer. So, welfare, yes, but welfare bounded by non-domination. And I think with this, I'm going to close it so that we can go to questions. Thank you so much.